All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to all joining us today in another opportunity to learn more about some very cool careers you can have as a doctoral student or postdoc. These conversations, these PhD chats are a chance to meet those who have walked the path before us and for us to hear more about the decision-making process, day-to-day role, joyful and not so joyful aspects of the career with the hopes that we might be able to resonate or not resonate with the values, motivations, and paths presented in this conversation, and so that it might empower us to make next step decisions that are right for us. So my name is Roshni and I run the career office called Futures at Johns Hopkins University that serves doctoral and postdoctoral students. And I often run into the challenge and also have the unique opportunity to serve varied disciplines. Since the audience today is from engineering, natural and physical sciences, humanities, and the social sciences, our panelists today also reflect that diversity of discipline as well. So please join me, and you can use those reactions now, in welcoming Dr. Thomas, Dr. McKinney, and Dr. Donaldson as our higher ed featured guests today. The session today is a moderated Q&A, but I've incorporated questions submitted by the attendees. So if you'd like to ask a question today as we chat live, type it anytime in the chat box. I have one eye on the chat box as well. So we're going to dive right in because from past experience, these conversations go by very, very quickly. So let me begin this chat by asking each of our guests a similar first question to sort of help us understand the decision-making process as they were all at the brink of graduating once. So we'll start with you, Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas, you are the Associate Dean for Graduate and Career Education and Diversity in Stanford University School of Medicine, and you earned a PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford, becoming the first Black woman to receive it. Thank you for being here today. My question to you is, could you take us back to your decision-making process as a graduate student? I know from your bio and career trajectory that your path was inspired by your own experience as a Black student in Georgia Tech and Stanford. With an engineering background, what were you considering back then? And can you share more about how your personal experience shaped your career trajectory?
Yeah, sure. So I decided I wanted my PhD when I was a freshman. My mentor, Gary May, who was a professor at Georgia Tech, who's now the chancellor at UC Davis, had me convinced for my first National Society of Black Engineers meeting that I wanted my PhD and I wanted to be a professor because his job seemed so cool from how he described it. And so I knew, once again, very early in my academic career that I wanted my PhD. And my intention firmly was to be a professor. Fast forward several years going into grad school, a Black woman in engineering. There were 900 grad students in my department of electrical engineering. There were 3 Black women the entire time I was there. And so it was a environment and a context that made me kind of reconsider my decision to want to be a professor about year 3 or 4. And so at that point in time, I knew I didn't want to be a professor, didn't necessarily know what I wanted to be. I had done 11 internships in all kinds of technology companies. So I worked at Intel, at IBM, at all the different types of tech companies. So I'd also had that experience. And I really realized that I also did not want to go into high tech because I really felt like I wanted to have a way of giving back. In all of my free time since my freshman year, I was involved in a lot of student groups, National Society of Black Engineers, a lot of mentoring groups, a lot of advocacy with administration, and meeting with the president and provost to demand action on issues important to students. And so when I was actually finishing up my PhD and trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, moving was not an option because my husband was at the time in seminary. And so we couldn't really move. And I was like, well, what can I do until we kind of figure out our next steps? And I looked at what I did in all my free time, running organizations, managing budgets and people, and planning events and programs, and realized that actually was what I found the most fun. That as much as I loved engineering and loved problem solving, it was actually the activities outside the research lab that were most engaging to me. What I also realized is that by flipping my CV inside out and putting all of my engineering related things as a footnote at the end of it, and actually focusing the body of my CV on my volunteer work, I actually had a really substantial CV that was really looking really good around working on issues of diversity and inclusion, running summer research programs, advocating for students. And so it really ended up being kind of a surprise where I was, as many of you all might be able to appreciate, procrastinating on my dissertation writing, trying to finish it up, and was looking around at the Stanford job site and saw this position for an assistant dean for multicultural student affairs, read the job description and said, that's what I do in all my free time, and therefore applied for that position. And so it was not really for me an intentional plan to go into higher education, but since I made that decision, I have not regretted it 1 minute. I don't feel like I wasted my PhD in any way because it really framed the way I approach problems and thinking. But once again, being able to be in the academic space and touch and influence through policy, through advocacy, through direct support, the lives of graduate students, particularly those from diverse backgrounds, has just been phenomenally enriching for me.
Thank you. I was nodding so profusely because that's exactly how I landed upon my job. It was only student org stuff, and then I shrunk down my research, exactly the same. But did you say 11 internships?
Yes, I interned. I did not. I kind of financed my own way through college. So I worked every summer since the summer before my freshman year.
Yeah.
I had an internship every summer.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. McKinney, you completed a PhD in microbiology from NYU, New York University, and more recently, a master's in professional studies in design management communications from Georgetown University, where you currently have a dual role as an assistant professor and an assistant dean of graduate and postdoctoral training in the biomedical graduation education field. I know you from the National Postdoc Association, and I know you as a strong advocate for students in diverse careers. Could you share a little bit about your thought process and your approach to designing your career, as it seems your career pathway in higher ed is still continuously growing and evolving?
Yes, even when you were describing it, it sounded like you were talking about 3 different people, but believe it or not, that's all me. And so during my postdoc is when I started to do a lot of career exploration, because my PhD was really focused on, establishing myself as someone that can really do science and complete one of these degrees. Because, growing up, that's not something that my inner city Chicago self ever thought that I was going to have in my future. So during college and PhD, I was pretty like laser focused. And then when I kind of woke up with my PhD after all that, at the end of my time at NYU, I really enjoyed my research. And so I went on into a postdoc pretty open-minded about the possibilities of what could happen. And so during that time, I really started to kind of dive into my project, gain independence and autonomy, do some more mentoring. And so I really enjoyed that. And so I was at the NIH for my postdoc, and it was a really great time to get exposed to some different aspects of program management to try to get at what my curiosity about what I want to do for my career. And so I did kind of a mini internship in our training office, and I also joined some of the fellows committees at the NIH level as well as the institute level. And so I gained a lot of leadership and program management experience. And that's when I really found out that that's what I like to do. So I could go into administration and still be able to impact students and trainees and fellows from a different context and primarily research. And so that's what really informed my segue into my first role at Georgetown. And I found that role on a career site, and I looked at the job description, and just as Dr. Thomas mentioned, I'm like, I'm doing all of that right now. And so, and as part of my, volunteer experience. And so I restructured my CV, sounding familiar. I restructured my CV, put my training and development experience for my volunteer roles right at the top, bullet pointed out everything that I'm doing. And I had a separate section for my postdoc research experience in parallel timeframes. And so all of the scientific aptitudes that I gained were very pertinent to my role at Georgetown, my prior role before I started picking up all these other hats, where I work in a biomedical science enterprise, relate to the trainees and students at that scientific level. And so having that sense of familiarity was very important. And so having my science aptitudes and my program management aptitudes on my resume were important. I just separated them out to make sure I highlight my administrative skills. So yes, similar sort of story, very different context.
Yeah, I think this is a good question to ask you because you did your postdoc. We have an audience question who says, does one have to have a postdoc or become a faculty member within an established academic research career to go into higher ed administration? So I think that goes along with what you were saying. Was a postdoc necessary to transition, do you think?
It depended on how much exploration and experiential activities that I would have done during graduate school. Like Dr. Thomas discussed various things that she did during graduate school that really informed what she wanted to do for her career. And so I kind of got to that point during my postdoc. And so during my postdoc is when I really explored and I really enjoyed the science. So that's why I did a postdoc, but I was open-minded about navigating opportunities to expand my skill set and expand the different types of careers that I dabbled in during my postdoc. And so, you know, while the postdoc wasn't extremely necessary to be able to do that work, like I hired somebody straight out of graduate school who had done those types of experiences during her time at graduate school. And so you can go right after graduate school into administrative roles of various levels. But the postdoc for me was a time to do some more career identity formation and just kind of take a deep dive into the research that I really loved.
And when did the assistant professorship role happen? You applied first to be in the sort of admin role, right? And then
yeah, so I started out as an assistant director where I built out career services, and then I started building out other administrative units that coalesced into kind of the founding assistant dean position that I have now. And then I started incorporating education research in the form of outcomes analysis of our graduates, evaluative studies of our program. So once I started doing faculty looking things, I picked up my education research faculty appointment. So I actually kind of did it backwards, but there's a number of people in the higher ed administrative space that do pick up faculty appointments when they start to incorporate that type of education research and fold it into their administrative portfolio. But it definitely wasn't a requisite for me to be able to become an administrator because I was an administrator first.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Donaldson, you are currently the Associate Dean of Planning and Communications at Rutgers School of Arts. And that's one reason why I reached out to you. I was very curious to know, what that role meant and where you oversee a full service communication and public relations office. Your PhD is in American literature, also from Rutgers in 2000. What were your professional goals as a graduate student, and how did you decide to move from academia and explore other things? I understand that you had an adjunct position and taught courses as a grad student as well. To add on to that, what was important to you in a professional career that helped you make your decision easier or harder?
Well, when I first entered into the PhD program here at Rutgers, I came with a master's. So when I graduated from getting my BA at the University of North Carolina, I had insisted I was not going to teach. I come from many, many generations of women who have been teachers, and I was like, no, that's not for me. But when I got to college, I couldn't imagine a semester without an English class. I just that was what I really loved. And my other classes, I did a lot of fine arts. So when I moved to Michigan with my husband, I started a master's program at Eastern Michigan University, and I started teaching right away. And I loved teaching, and I particularly loved that I was teaching a group of students who were from mostly first in their families to go to college, that had not really thought of that as something that was open to them necessarily, and really working with this group of students, getting them really enthusiastic about literature as well. So I came to Rutgers. It was a great place to come as a non-traditional student. It was a large entering class. It was people from all walks of life. And as a kind of an older student to be starting my PhD, I felt like this was a really great place for that. So as I finished up my PhD and I already was having children, I did a lot of volunteer work in the community and also a lot of things at Rutgers that are so similar to the kinds of things that Dr. Thomas and Dr. McKinney have done. Like I organized two literature conferences as a graduate student. And so doing a lot of those kinds of volunteer work. I mean, actually like in my little notes to myself, like volunteer work and working in these kinds of different ways the whole time when you're in graduate school, and kind of keeping those connections to the rest of the university outside of your program, and maybe also into the community where you live, are really important for imagining all these different types of trajectories that you might have. And so I did do a lot of volunteer work at the schools, and I did a lot of volunteer work in different organizations in my community, places where I had positions as secretary of the organization, different things like that. And so it was through those connections that I learned of a position that was available at the New Jersey Council of the Humanities as the program officer for the Teacher Institute. And so it was not really possible for us also to move at that time as I finished my PhD. And so I was looking for other things that I could do that were still connected to education. And I think, like Dr. Thomas and Dr. McKinney have expressed as well, like that kind of work that you do with students and that connect with the younger students, the undergraduates, those connections become really important. And so when I worked at the council, it was clear to me that what I really loved about doing that was that I was helping create professional development programs in the humanities for K through 12 teachers across New Jersey. And to do that, I was recruiting faculty that I knew at Rutgers and other New Jersey universities to come and lead those programs. And when I was asked to sort of start taking on some other responsibilities at the council that seemed like they should have been totally interesting to me, like working on Smithsonian, it's called, I think, Smithsonian on the Street, and bringing sort of Smithsonian exhibits to local museums and towns and everything, I really realized that what I wanted to be doing was working in education and higher education. And for me, it was really important to be still involved in the education that takes place in public universities. And so when this Rutgers reorganized their undergraduate structure from this kind of English sort of looking system of all these different colleges and created one large school of arts and sciences, the opportunity became available to work with the first deans who were establishing the school and thinking about this new community, this new school that was coming into creation. And that was how I first got this position. And so it was a really great opportunity to come back into close work with higher education, to be working with faculty, to be working with students and graduate students. And the position has changed so much over the dozen years that I've had it, that it has been a great opportunity for me too, to sort of recreate the position as new tasks are needed to be taken care of.
Okay. Well, thank you. Those are all excellent perspectives. I think we got a sense of the motivations for why you wanted to go into these career paths. And I wanted to do that because making career decisions often requires a deep dive into what would be meaningful to us in the future. We're not just looking for a job, we're looking for a meaningful, fulfilling career. So thank you. I wanted to ask you all to share a little bit about your current role. From my own experience in higher ed, it would be silly of me to ask what your day looks like, because I'm sure it changes from day to day. But what does a typical week in your shoes looks like? What do you do in each of your specific roles? Dr. Donaldson, since you had the mic class, can you share what an assistant dean of planning and communication does? And then we can move on to Dr. Thomas, followed by Dr. McKinney.
Yes, in the early days of my position, the planning aspect was much more predominant. And so I did a lot of things like organizing the workshops for new chairs, creating handbooks for the new chairs as they came in, meeting all the new faculty, introducing them to all of the kind of aspects of the school that were outside of their department and the different kinds of support that they could get from the IT, from communications and all of that. Lately, my position has moved to a more fully communications role. And so the last sort of 8 years, but now my week is really framed by an email that goes out from my office every Thursday, just earlier today, and has events and articles about what's going on in the school. And so in my small office, which is made up of me and a senior writer and a graphic designer and a work study student, we put together each week a curated newsletter that has all these events that are going on around campus for the upcoming week. About 5 or 6 articles in which Rutgers faculty are quoted or where they've put in an op-ed in the newspaper, something like that. So we write what we call the T's, and it goes in, we pick out the images and all of that. And then we also include original content that we've written in the week previously. Now, my office does not deal with what's technically like media relations. We don't have to do any sort of the crisis communications. And one of the things that I do really like about my position is because it's located in the school, and the School of Arts and Sciences is larger than many universities, but it still keeps me very close to the mission and the connection with the faculty. You know, so I know the faculty, I meet students all the time, and when we're writing the stories, and so it feels very involved in that way. But during the school year, it has this rhythm of every week, this particular e-newsletter goes out.
Okay. Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, much like Dr. Donaldson, my career trajectory in terms of what I do on a daily basis has changed a lot over the years. When I was first hired, I was hired actually kind of explicitly as a diversity officer. And so literally I was doing recruiting, so flying around the country, going to conferences and visiting universities. I was administering our summer research program focused on diversity. So application processes and working with faculty for selection and making faculty kind of matching for mentors and things like that. Working a lot with current students around issues that may arise. Running a diversity-focused fellowship program as well. So that was kind of my portfolio. But what's interesting, I think, particularly when you have a PhD, is that based on what your training is, it finds ways to reemerge over the course of your career. So here I was doing diversity work, and I asked what I thought was a simple question. What are the numbers? And then I discovered that everyone at the university had to stand behind the line of one woman who supplied everyone's data, including the president and provost. But I became friends with her, and she taught me how to do my own data. And then data became an official part of my role. And then I took over all of the fellowships, not just the diversity fellowships. And then I started having other staff reporting to me in that office. So it really started to grow in that way. In my role now, I actually oversee all of student services for the School of Medicine, focused on MD, on PhD and master students. So everything from our wellness programming, our diversity programming, graduate aid and funding. I have people who work on training and mentoring, staff who work on aspects of actually the reason you see my background right now is we have 350 students joining us virtually right now for our interviews for the biosciences. So my office oversees that. And so right now my role is very different. My office has 12 full-time staff plus 4 who work part-time or temps in the office, in addition to a lot of students. And a lot of my job now is about fighting fires and establishing policy and dealing with crises. So my husband laughs at me. He wonders how I could be happy in a job where I spend, I average probably 4 to 12 meetings a day, all on Zoom. And that's normal for me. And, a chunk of those meetings are meeting with my own staff, because I have, once again, a lot of direct reports in my office who I meet with on a weekly basis to kind of help them to do their jobs. But a whole lot of committees and groups that are establishing policy. And so once again, lots and lots of meetings, but really about kind of impacting change, I would say, is the bulk of it. And then the last piece is the financial management, trying to understand all the various arcane university policies. And when they're not working for my team, spending oftentimes weeks fighting for trying to figure out, how do you change or fix or at least clarify policies and things like that. So for me as an engineer, it's actually been fascinating. People say, don't you get bored? I'm like, oh no, every day is a new adventure. This time last year, we had just 3 days to transform our 350-person in-person event to an event that would apply under the then COVID rules of no more than 100 people in a room at a time. And we had a couple days to transform it. And so, now with COVID and all these other things that are going on as well, it really is about problem solving for me now. It's an issue comes up for either my staff, for the students, processes, and how can I figure out who are the people who need to make something happen? Who are the stakeholders who could get us to either come to a consensus, to make policy change, or to push things through? And for me, it's very empowering, because as someone who wants to really kind of leave something behind for others, the idea, if you think about, you can impact individuals in some ways. If you can actually change the institutional infrastructure for how things work, because people hate to make change, once you institute something that's improved, it'll be there for decades to come. And so for me, that really is, I think, part of, what gets me up in the morning is that I know that what I'm doing, I'm laying the groundwork to make it easier and easier and easier for students to really excel in their academic careers, because once again, I'm there kind of fighting fires. I do have student engagement, but not really as much direct. Sadly, most of my direct student engagement is when there's a serious issue that comes up, and they come to me as the person to help them arbitrate and understand university rules and things like that. But because my office directly supports students, I can always kind of lean in and talk to students whenever I want to. I also created my own class. So I'm not a professor, but I asked for and received a lecturer appointment because I've been teaching a class for the last 16 years for first-year incoming PhD students across the entire university. I kind of call it all the things I wish I had known before my third year of grad school. I'm going to tell you all today on day one. And so that gives me an opportunity as well. So once again, when you have your PhD, even if you're not a formal professor, faculty member, you still can create opportunities to engage and to teach in the areas that are important to you as well.
Dr. McKinney?
Sure. So yeah, my day is definitely all over the place as well. And that's what I really like about the work that I do. My response is definitely a combination of Dr. Donaldson and Dr. Thomas. My career definitely went through phases. I've been at the same place for about 5 years since doing my postdoc. And so my career has had a couple of different phases. It definitely started akin to what Dr. Donaldson mentioned in sort of a build phase. There was a lot of things that sort of didn't exist. They existed, but there were a lot of things to build out infrastructure-wise with building out a career service portfolio for the graduate students and the postdocs. So there was a lot of sort of technology implementation for building out a career service management platform for advising and employer relations and things like that, like building out a career center. And so there's a lot of that building, a lot of building of infrastructure for career service guidelines, how we interact with our programs and with our students. And so I built that out within my first year or so. And then I started working closely with our postdoc association, which has started to build up around that time as well, because there was no dedicated administrative role that served postdocs. And so in working with those trainees, referring back to what Dr. Thomas was mentioning with building out policies and implementing change, that's what led to me designing in my assistant dean portfolios incorporate a few different functionalities that I had started to build up over those times, including serving postdocs, expanding out our training grant support portfolio so that we could expand capacity for training. I, assembled all of that into I always loved design, intentional design. So I applied that to my role. I designed a portfolio and showed it to our dean, and she took it to our executive vice president and said, we have to do this. And that's where my permanent assistant dean role came from, that now has incorporated postdocs into our support portfolio. And so that was a really profound step in my career that was really important to me. And so that involved a lot of advocacy, a lot of grassroots advocacy at the beginning. I also did a lot of workshops, hands-on workshops, interacting with students a lot. Nowadays, alluding to some of what Dr. Thomas mentioned, putting out a lot of fires. I'm working a lot with higher ups and cross-campus stakeholders to make sure that our team has what they need in order to execute their functions, because they're now more boots on the ground, engaging with and meeting with students and postdocs, as well as with our program faculty. And so I do a lot of engaging with finance to make sure they have the resources that they need. I've got 3 direct reports, director level reports who manage their own portfolios. And so the other part of my job is really focused on data management. I'm naturally introverted. So when I get tired of talking to people all day from all my Zoom meetings, I get to hunker down with the data. And so from the build phase, I was building out databases of student and trainee outcomes. And then I started to analyze those and publish some of that data in the peer-reviewed literature or analysis for training grants. That's how I built out a proposal development functionality in my division as well. We do training grant support, but it was all rooted in building out a database management structure. And so I also have a very heavy data component to my role and what my staff do. And so, yeah, my everyday is composed of, tons of meetings. I don't get to interact too much with students and trainees directly anymore. But like Dr. Thomas mentioned, my staff do as well. So I can definitely pop up in a workshop. I don't teach a dedicated course, but I do tend to pop up in a 3-hour lecture or so. And throughout most of our programs, they put me in their courses so that the students and trainees can get career development. And so it's definitely a hodgepodge. And so that's what I really enjoy about it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. You all alluded to this notion in your previous answers. There is that there is this understanding or belief that when you leave academia, your PhD training and research work is wasted. And Dr. Thomas, you said, you reframed it in your mind as it's not a waste. In fact, all of you are using components of your PhD training in some way or the other. I know Dr. Donaldson, for you, it's your writing and communication, skills like, and for Dr. McKinney, it's your data analysis skills. Dr. Thomas, can you dive in a little bit more in detail about how your PhD training might have prepared you for the role you have today?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that particularly people who are from kind of STEM backgrounds often overlook is that most people who work in administration and higher education have either a social sciences or humanities background. What that means, particularly over the course of the last 20 years when technology has been exploding, is that they were people who would never feel comfortable trying out a new technology. They would mainly relied on kind of existing systems. And since we all know that in many higher education offices, we have almost zero budgets, you can't afford any of the systems that would do it for you. And so therefore, people were really relying on a lot of things that were very manual in terms of processes. And so I think for me, the idea that I've never seen a technology that I'm not confident that if I have the instruction manual and some help stuff, I can't figure it out. That means that we were able to do things like create an online application system when we only had a budget of $3,000, which would have never 20 years ago in particular been able to create a system with that. When I look at processes, I'm very process driven. Why are we doing this process this way? Why are we asking for information in this way? And really kind of forcing in some ways people to really think about how they're processing and how it impacts other people who are part of it as well. The other piece is the data piece. Once again, I couldn't get my own data. I talked to the woman who does the data and was like, well, how do you do this? And she explained it. And I was like, oh, I can do that. It's just manipulating data and, tables and charts and understanding graphs and different university data sources and merging data. And I can do all of that. And so once again, this idea that it really allowed someone in the space who was comfortable with technology, once again, in a space where most of my other colleagues would never once again touch a new technology in that way. And so you really end up becoming someone who's able to kind of leverage your background in STEM and your comfort with technology and process and things like that to think about really how to support the processes in the administrative infrastructure. I think also the engineer in me says that there's never a problem we can't solve. We may not get to the answer we wanted to get to, but we can definitely get further than where we are right now. And so that just means that I walk into things often very kind of, glass half full. Okay, they won't let us do those 20 things, but we can do these 2 things, right? And once again, kind of thinking about problems in that way. So once again, for me, very much, even because my PhD is in parallel computer architectures. Nothing at all to do with what I'm doing. But once again, the types of training and skills and mindset that training as an engineer brought me really has served me well.
Dr. Donaldson, I'd love to hear a humanist perspective on how it prepared you for your role in higher ed as well.
Well, I will just to speak to that, technology comment there about humanities. On my first day on the job, I had to get my first lesson in how to maintain a website, how to log in, how to update, because at that moment when I started, really the school website was just a static page. There was it had not been conceived as something that would actually be providing any kind of new and cutting edge information about like what was happening in the school. And so that was sort of up to me to kind of move that all forward, like working with the SAS or School of Arts and Sciences, IT staff, and developing the ways in which we could use the website, and then, trying to keep the website kind of up to date and with what is it responsive? When did that happen? And, even now, we provide, training throughout all our departments. So we have 160 websites within the School of Arts and Sciences, and we need to have somebody in each of those units who can maintain that site. And so, SASIT provides that training, and I go and I talk about how the website is not just an IT invention, but it is a communications device, right? And so when you're working on the website, it's always like, what is the message that's being conveyed by that website? And so I talk to the departments who potentially originally, they didn't want a template that looked like all the other departments, that looked like the school. They really wanted to be individual kind of Wild West culture here at Rutgers is really, really prevalent, so kind of thinking about how you talk to the faculty and you talk to the faculty committees who've been put in place to think that they are going to design their website. And, you need to come in as a staff member and say, well, there is a template, and so how do you do that persuasiveness? And I have found that in my position that my experience with teaching and my academic background has really helped with messaging to the faculty. And when I was first in the position, I didn't know that I was going to be, and this is one of your other questions maybe later, but I didn't know that I was going to be what's now called a brand manager, and that I was going to have to see that everybody used the Rutgers logo appropriately on all paper, right? So I don't know if I would have maybe just like stepped right into this position if I had known that I was going to be so affectionately called the logo police for so many years. But actually, trying to explain this idea of that Rutgers has a brand, has a reputation, that is a story that people tell about the school, and sort of thinking about that and how to communicate that. Really, as many of us who go in to get a PhD, right, we're not interested in the corporate world. Like, we're not interested in those widgets, right? We are really interested in mission-driven work. And so to bring in ideas of marketing or communication into the university setting can really, really be a challenge. And, it's a great challenge. It's been a great challenge for me, but it can be kind of surprising to the faculty that that's something that the university wants you to be thinking about.
Okay. Those are good perspectives of what skills you could use. Dr. McKinney, what are something that your PhD training did not help you with your job and that you had to learn on the fly? For example, financial management and leadership. Not everyone has those skill sets. So if someone is thinking, I don't know what this means, I don't have the experience, what did you learn on the job, and is it possible?
Yeah, you have to come into these jobs being adaptable and being trainable. That's really key to success. And, with kind of the PhD mindset, sometimes, especially if you're siloed in the lab, you kind of get into your own level of your own mode of expertise. And you're like, I can figure out anything. Of course, I can do this. And so you kind of have to put that pride aside when you join a cross-functional administrative culture where you're working with different types of teams that are vastly different in kind of the scope of their functionality. Like, I work very closely with finance, I work very closely with academic affairs, work very closely with communications. I work very closely with a number of different teams that do very different work than I do, but we have to integrate our work in order to accomplish similar goals. And so that becomes a very important skill set to develop. Some of that, particularly in the team science realm, you kind of learn if you're working on team science-based projects, how to work with cross-functional teams. So you learn a little bit of that if that's incorporated into your training. But otherwise, that can be kind of a leap for some people. It's paradigms to understand how to work with people who do very different work than you and understand how their work gets incorporated into what you have to do to accomplish your goals. And so definitely team building becomes something that you have to learn. Some of the other things that you learn about how processes work in the financial realm, like Dr. Thomas had alluded to, if it's protocol based, you kind of figure it out and you do it, right? SOPs work kind of the same way in lab as they do in administrative context. I can follow a protocol to get a project done as easily as I can follow a protocol to get a vendor paid. That type of system level thinking, though, is something you don't want to take for granted, because that's not something that you find a lot of administrators without PhDs do extremely well. Is think about the different entities of processes that are connected from the top. Like you can, like for me, you know, I can think of the different steps of a Western blot to get bans on the gel, and that includes running the gel and doing the antibody staining. Those are different protocols, part of the same process to leading to the bans. But if you don't look at it from a systems approach and troubleshoot each step along the way, you're not going to get any bans. And so the same thing applies with getting a vendor paid. I had to build out a procurement protocol to get a vendor paid that included a bunch of different steps of the process that people didn't see the whole way through. And so that paradigm is something that you definitely don't want to take for granted with PhD training.
We have an audience question, but I think all the panelists sort of answered this question already, which was, how did you find your first jobs? And most of you said websites and networking. And then what was the best way for applicants to catch the attention of the hiring committee? Panelists mentioned that they really reworked their CV. One of the ways in which they did that was match the description of the job to what they had. So I'll move on from that question and ask you, Dr. McKinney, the audience wanted to know how you balance all your duties and boards and everything. How does work-life balance look for you all? And Dr. Thomas and Dr. Donaldson, you said long hours, sometimes 12 Zoom meetings. So any tips? Maybe we'll talk about pre-pandemic life. What does work-life balance look like? Dr. McKinney?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so, well, I think I actually got better at it after the pandemic started, because I started to incorporate more wellness activities to get myself away from the computer. But I definitely picked up a yoga practice with my husband. We work out together now on the living room carpet with our yoga instructor on the screen. And so that's been very helpful to really pull you away from work, and incorporating mindfulness activities to give yourself the space to pull yourself away from work, I think is incredibly important. And so however you want to do that is okay. I used to run treadmill back when we could go in gyms and be around people, and I would say anything that works for you to pull yourself into a different zone from what your day-to-day is for at least 30 minutes or so. If it's meditation, running, yoga, something, mindfulness is incredibly important for those resets during the day.
And Dr. Donaldson, how do you manage sort of the hectic schedule that comes with your role?
Well, I think one of the things that Dr. Thomas and Dr. McKinney have both touched on is the sort of way to be adaptable, that sort of being really adaptable and also being, entrepreneurial in your position is a real way to help you with that balance, because you can feel when it's the right time, to take that project on with managing the data that Dr. Thomas has described, and it takes a while to kind of figure out the balance with what you're already expected to do and the way that you'd really like to make your role grow. But I think one of the things that you do find in these positions, as we've all reflected on, is that there is a lot of opportunity for growth in your position and seeing something that really needs to be done and finding the right team that you need to work with. And as Dr. McKinney said, people across the university have all these different skill sets, and it often takes people from many different areas of the university. And also sort of what I was touching on a little earlier is that, a lot of things take a lot of buy-in. And so the university community doesn't really like new ways of doing things to be sprung on it. And so if you are really thinking that you have a great solution, like Dr. Thomas was saying, and that you can realize that this will be some legacy for you, it really helps to be working across and be thinking about how to keep that that kind of balance, and when you have that bandwidth to go forward. And then, yes, it's been great that my Pilates instructor went online, so I can transform my office into a Pilates studio a few times a week and get a break. Also, yeah, my husband and I have been taking really long walks in town, on days where the weather here has allowed. So those are important too. At Rutgers, the university is very sprawling. And so one of the things that happened for me right away was that I was in Zoom meetings, 4 hours straight, when previously, because I'm in a communications and I'm in a service unit, and I want to be the liaison to these different units, I go to everybody else's location for the meetings. And so it could be a 20-minute drive, or it could be a 20-minute walk, depending on which part of campus you're going to. And so you had all these built-in downtimes to sort of process what you had just been doing, kind of prep yourself for where you're going and what you're going to be meeting about and what your goals are during that sort of enforced quiet time. And certainly the Zoom life leaves you no buffer. And if you don't build it in, it can be really a challenge. At the end of the day, you can be really exhausted. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I need to incorporate some of those tips in my own life right now. But each of you had said something that was common, which was you saw there was some sort of building and creating on your parts. And so I see that there's some sort of freedom and creativity that comes with your roles as well. Dr. Thomas, for example, you started, you're the executive director for Green Scholars, which is a STEM enrichment program for the Bay Area youth of African ancestry. So freedom and creativity you have in your role to launch these innovative curriculums and do some programming. I can see that as being something that you like, that's impactful and that's a rewarding part of your job. And you'd mentioned as well, working with students and being a change maker was impactful. I wanted to ask the flip side of that question. Could you share what you would consider to be the most challenging aspect of each of your roles? And I think I'll get one perspective and then move on to the next question. Dr. Thomas?
Yeah. I think it's two pieces. So first of all, actually, I wanted to quickly kind of address the whole life balance. You have to be intentional. When I first started working, I limited, even now, my 12 Zoom meetings come between 8 and 5 largely. And that's intentional because I force them in between there because they will, sprawl whatever. In terms of the most challenging part, quite frankly, it's managing people and personalities and egos. That someone said that there's no politics like university politics, that universities could teach politicians something about politics. This idea that kind of breaks into what Dr. Donaldson said, that you have to understand all of the stakeholders. You sometimes spend an entire year laying the groundwork to get people on board, to make what you think is a simple change. And so it really is this idea that you can't just go do things by yourself, that you can't just go and just do it because you feel like it. You really have to figure out, how do I bring along all these people with me on this journey to whatever we're trying to go? And that can be very challenging. The other piece is all of the inane university policies, many of which are not written down, which just means it's very hard sometimes to navigate things when you can't find anyone who knows the answer. Okay, whatever the answer is, I'll do it. But what is the answer? Can I not? What's the rule? Who knows the rule? Yeah. And so that can be very frustrating, I think, in the university environment in particular, because people are not that great at documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I have an audience question. I can't believe our time flies by when we're having these conversations. But the question is, do you think that there are any limitations for international students to move into this career? And I can speak for myself. I am an international student myself who moved into this career. But do you guys have any perspectives or knowledge about hiring practices for international visas in university admin?
I think it largely goes through the same process that staff go through. I mean, that faculty go through, because it's a university process, and faculty are actually staff as well, technically. And so I don't think it's necessarily any harder than, say, going into a faculty role if you have the appropriate visa status, or the university is able to sponsor that type of visa status. Then you would be kind of equally, a part of an opportunity.
Okay. And this is for everyone as well. What should someone who's in grad school right now, maybe they don't have extensive student org experience or volunteering experience, what can one do right now to sort of build up their CV and prepare them for transitioning into a higher ed role? Dr. McKinney?
So I know from my office, we send out these opportunities for people to engage our office, to engage the student groups and trainee groups that are on campus. And they take advantage of that. And it could range in scope from writing a blog post for our blog, or the Career Catalyst blog. I like that name, it's clever. So we came up with that blog a few years back, and it's a great way to get students to contribute some writing to the blog from their own perspectives, and alumni write for it, current students write for it, and it's a way to get students to write about things outside of their technical expertise. And so those types of experiences, take advantage of those experiences, be intentional about some of the things that you participate in, and intentional about the skills that you're gaining from them, and document what you're doing. And I think that's the best thing you could do starting right now, is to get involved with activities that are happening right under your nose.
Or even sort of, attending these and then connecting with the guests later, and improving networking. That is also a skill that you can build right now. So one question from Alexandra, I think this could be for Dr. Thomas and anybody, Dr. McKinney. Can you go back and forth between teaching roles and admin roles? Or do you generally see people stay in admin once they reach those positions? So maybe Dr. McKinney, you can answer this. Do you do both on a weekly basis? How's your time divided?
I would say it's mostly admin most of the time, including weekends and days that don't exist. But other than that, teaching, I really value curriculum development. So we build out infrastructure in tech platforms such as Canvas to implement some of our programs. And so there's some teaching incorporated with that. And I also teach career development as part of some of the seminar courses of our individual programs. And that's happens about roughly once every other week. And so that's kind of the breakdown of mine. Education research I do as part of my faculty hat. So that's a lot of data analysis and evaluative studies of actual career development programs. So there is some education research mixed into my scholarship as well as grant writing.
Okay. Dr. Thomas, how would your advice change for someone leaving the PhD and just has their master's?
Well, just in terms of going into administration,
Yeah.
Interestingly, depending on the type of job you're going into and the type of office, you actually might have a leg up. Quite frankly, PhDs who work in student affairs often get extra harsh looks because people always ask, are you here because you want to be, or do you see this as just a layover until you get your faculty job? And student affairs is such an area that kind of derives such passion that no one would want a coworker who they feel like is not there because they want to be there when the hours get long and things like that. So interestingly, people with the PhD often get extra questions about, this is an administrative role. Do you actually want this role? Do you care that no one cares that you have a PhD? The faculty care, but the other staff don't. And so it really is sometimes a hard kind of ego blow to recognize that no one who you're working with cares that you have a PhD. And quite frankly, it's not necessary to do the job.
Mm.
And so being able to kind of say, I'm doing this because I want to, not because I needed this training to do it. For some people, it would be a hard thing to accept. I mean, you work so hard on this thing, you're so proud of it, and now no one cares.
Yeah.
So that can be a struggle too, in terms of when you're choosing to be administrative, you are not a faculty member.
Mm.
I am very clear where the hierarchy lies. It's students, faculty, and then me.
Yeah.
And people often don't think about me. So that really is something to really consider in terms of, are you comfortable enough with where you are and who you are, that you can set your PhD aside and do the work and be okay with that. And it's fine if you're not. It just means you probably want a role that is more tightly tied to your field versus a purely administrative role.
Okay. Okay, we're here with the last question for each of you. Leave us with one important piece of advice you would give with someone, especially from your background, humanities, engineering, and biomedical science. What would you want to say as one last piece of advice before we close the conversation today? Dr. Donaldson?
I think that it's really great to be looking for opportunities and role models around the university. And if you take a look, you will see that there are so many people with PhDs doing all kinds of different jobs around the university, and you can meet them and you can reach out. So many of my colleagues across, particularly as Dr. Thomas was saying, in like student advising, have PhDs or are ABD, that, and I would say that you will really, if you look around, there are so many people who have PhDs who are helping run the university from many, many different locations. And I would say that that would be something to look for where you are now, and see who you can see that you could talk to, that you could meet with, and that you could see what was being offered there as well.
Talk to people. That's important. Dr. Thomas?
I think to really be clear about what you want to do, and when you say administration, what that means. So for instance, for me, when I went into administration, I was very clear that I did not want to work in a community center or in residential education and those types of roles, because those types of roles have lots of evening hours. And I was pregnant when I started working. So I was clear I needed to have boundaries on my work hours. And so really being clear about if you want to do kind of what I would call more academic administration, working in a department or a school with more of an academic lens, or if you want to work in something that is more student affairs, student focused, more about kind of their well-being outside of the classroom per se. And so kind of thinking about as you're going into it, which framing you're comfortable with. You may be comfortable with both, but being very clear that those types of jobs have very different types of work expectations, and knowing once again what's important to you.
Thank you for that. Dr. McKinney, I want to end with your piece of advice.
I would say, and this actually gets at, I think, one of these questions that just popped up in the chat. Make sure that you're paying close attention to what the job descriptions are asking, and align your experience with what the job description is asking, and frame your experience in such a way that you can convince the hiring manager and hiring committee that you can do the work, even if it's based on the volunteer experiences and not necessarily full-time or 20-hour-a-week experiences. Frame your ad hoc experiences and your shorter term experiences and projects in such a way that you can show the hiring manager that you can do the work outlined in the job description, and use empathy to make that process about them and their needs.
The cover letter is essential. I will drop an application in a moment if your cover letter did not meet what my job request said.
Yeah. Absolutely. If you guys, I just did a cover letter workshop yesterday, so you can go to the YouTube channel to go check it out. Thank you, everybody. I know we were at 5 o'clock. We always want to end on time. And if we didn't get your questions answered, I think we answered 99.999% of all the questions. I want to thank all of our guests today for taking the time out of your busy schedules, and Zoom fatigue is real, to talk to some of our graduate students and postdocs. We're incredibly lucky to have these kinds of conversations to reflect on. It's almost like going on 3 informational interviews at once. So audience, I hope you enjoyed this chat and everyone's perspectives today. Thank you all also for taking this opportunity and time despite your hectic schedules. If you have any comments and questions, please share them with me via email. I also work in higher ed. I could direct them to others at Hopkins as well, or I can answer them as well. So I will follow up with all of you to do a quick capture of your experience today. So thank you everyone for showing up, and thank you panelists, the amazing advice that you gave us. I'm going to stop recording now.